This is Eat, Sleep, Invest, the marketing podcast for real estate investors to get more deals.
Hey, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Eat, Sleep, and Invest. I'm your host, Brian Driscoll, and I'm here with Chad Griffiths. What's going on, Chad?
No, not a whole lot. Thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited to talk with you.
Thanks for coming, man. So you're up in Canada, right?
Up in Canada. I like to say as a reference point, I'm kind of straight up from the Dutton family ranch, if for any Yellowstone fans out there.
Nice. So today's going to be pretty interesting. Normally we're talking single families, we're talking land. Chad, you have a different background. You're in an industrial space, right? Give us a little on your background.
Yeah, so actually I started in residential. I started buying and selling some houses with some friends a number of years ago, probably 20 years ago. Got an itch for real estate. Ended up finding my way into commercial real estate brokerage in 2005. Ended up focusing on industrial real estate. 2014, I started investing in industrial real estate. And with my partners and a whole lot of debt, we've accumulated a pretty sizable portfolio of just industrial properties right now. So it's I love the title of Eat, Sleep, and Breathe for investment real estate. I kind of am like the Eat, Sleep, Breathe industrial real estate.
Nice. So now when we're talking industrial, what are we talking?
Yeah, that's a great point to kick it off on, because there is a little bit of misconception on what industrial real estate is. Some people will think of like those old manufacturing buildings that could be a horror set in a movie, but industrial real estate has come a long way. So I usually break industrial into three different categories: warehousing, and this is like the big distribution centers that we're all familiar with. I'm sure Amazon has developed a whole bunch of industrial in Pittsburgh or in the area, because you're close to the Lehigh Valley as well, I'm guessing, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah, we have Amazon, a couple other places.
Yeah, so that's become like a huge part of the industrial real estate industry is just warehouses. So things come in, get stored, can be stored for anywhere from a few minutes to a few years, and then it gets shipped out. But the whole purpose of it is things get brought in, stored, repackaged, reassembled, and then sent out. So those are the big Amazon distribution centers. It's not just Amazon, though. Like when you think of the FedEx and all the 3PLs out there. The other major one is manufacturing. And this can be anything from like a small auto mechanic that works on cars in a building, all the way up to the Boeing factory just outside of Everett, which is a 4 million square foot building. They just bring in all the raw materials. They build, assemble, produce airplanes, and then the finished product goes out. So that's kind of like the manufacturing space where just things are made or manufactured. The other one is flex industrial, and that's generally meant to describe all the properties that are zoned industrial but aren't necessarily used for manufacturing or warehousing. And I've seen a ton of different uses in this category. And I'll give you an example with one property that I own, which is a flex industrial property. We have one tenant in there that's straight office space. We have a hot tub store. We have a cabinet store. We have a store that sells equestrian products for horses. So like none of those are really industrial tenants, but it's an industrial zone building. So that flex actually makes up a lot of the ancillary product that you see. And you could see art galleries. I've seen churches, bottle depots, self-storage, you name it. It can kind of fit into that industrial flex category.
Okay, and on the flex one, is that mainly because someone purchased a building, couldn't find a warehouse that was suited for, and then ended up renting to the ballerina school or whatever it is to occupy that space?
Yeah, great question. And it could be a little bit of both. Quite often you could actually get a little higher rates from having companies that are in that flex category. Like generally speaking, an office user will probably be willing to pay a little bit more than a company that's just storing things in there. So if the building is compatible for an office user and perhaps it's already built out as that, or it'd be inexpensive to retrofit a building for that purpose, you might be able to get a little bit of rent. But quite often it's just because there are limitations. So in the example, that flex building that we own, it's 14-foot ceilings in there. So it's really not conducive for anybody that wants to put a lot of shelving or racking in there. It doesn't have really good loading areas for trucks coming in and out. So it's an industrial zone building, but it's really not even conducive for manufacturing or warehousing. So a little bit of both. We get higher rates than we would have if we had just a manufacturing building, but it wouldn't really work for those uses anyways.
Okay, that's an interesting thing you just brought up there too, because most of the times in commercial, we're looking at square foot, right? But with industrial, you guys are looking at cubic footage, right?
It's It's definitely trending that way, and that is becoming a hot topic. There was a survey that was actually just put out, and it was surveying all the companies that occupy warehouse space, and they said that was the number one thing that they're looking for right now is ceiling height. And for the exact reason that you said is now you're looking at it from a cubic footage standpoint, where if you only had a building with 20-foot ceilings and you compared it to one with 40-foot ceilings, if you could stack that much extra space because you have higher ceiling heights, now all of a sudden you're taking advantage of the same footprint of the building, but you're utilizing that much more. So it definitely is trending towards cubic footage being more important. But I think right now we still talk square footage day to day. Like that's still the number one thing that I'm always talking about is what's the rent per square foot? How much square foot is the building? How much square feet is the land? Square footage is still probably the driving metric, but cubic footage is becoming increasingly more important.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, especially for people just getting into the space, because you'd think, okay, I'm going to go buy a warehouse, and then depending on the height of the ceilings, things like that, that could dictate whoever can rent from you, things like that. And I heard you talking somewhere else too about the construction type can dictate some different things too, with like the posts, things like that. Why don't you talk a little bit on that side?
Yeah, there's a few things we could discuss on there. So you could look at the building envelope itself. So whether the building was manufactured out of precast concrete or whether it's steel. Precast concrete is going to have a lot longer of a lifespan. It generally looks better than that corrugated steel panel, but the steel is a lot cheaper to put up as well. So there's always an inherent trade-off between quality and cost. Probably one that's driving the conversation more right now than even the envelope would be how the interior is set up. And by that, I just mean like the columns. So you could appreciate a warehouse in some scenarios can be 200 feet long, can be 100 feet wide. You need to have the foundational support in there to keep the roof up there. So quite often that'll mean that there's columns throughout. And that column grid or column spacing is important for companies that need to utilize that space because there's physical impediments inside that warehouse space now. Like those columns are in the way of things happening. So depending on how close those columns are, the column spacing, that can be a pretty big influence. Some buildings will even be built, what's the terminology most often used is clear span. So that's where it's actually built with no interior columns. But again, there's that trade-off between cost and the value that it's providing. Ideally, nobody wants columns. The columns aren't helping anything. They're structural. They need to be there. But it's also a lot less expensive to build with columns versus doing that clear span. So that all factors into how a company is looking at these spaces. And equally as important, I think an investor needs to be cognizant of this as well, because if they are buying a building, and this is where I think industrial is unique in the standpoint that one oversight or one mistake can be very costly for an investor. Because if you buy a property and let's say it has 18-foot ceiling heights, just using an arbitrary number, and you didn't realize that all the competition has 30-foot ceiling heights, you're now at a clear disadvantage for what the competition is. And that might mean having to lease it at a much lower lease rate. That might mean that there's not even tenants that are interested in it. So knowing all these important characteristics of a warehouse are really important to mitigate any downside risk that you have.
So when you're looking at a property and thinking about purchase it, what things are you looking for? Like what's going through your head and how are you calculating what the offer price should be if it's a good fit or if it's not a good fit?
So probably a little different from any other asset classes. I'll always go and look at the building as if it was vacant first. Even if there's a 10-year tenant in there, I'm still looking at what that building is worth if it was vacant. Because I'm a big believer that a tenant is going to leave eventually. They might leave at the end of their term. They might have a change in business plans. They might go bankrupt at some point. They might do a midnight move. Probably not if it's a company like Amazon, but it does happen with some of those smaller and medium-sized companies. So I'm always expecting that the tenant will leave at some point. So if I go through the exercise of treating that building as if it was vacant, then I start going through the due diligence of seeing, okay, well, what are the ceiling heights? Is that what's common in the market? Everything that I own is within 10 minutes of where I'm sitting right now, so I know this market very well. But if I was looking into another market, this is the same exercise I'd be going through is what's the common ceiling height? How many loading doors are there? Is it dock? Is it grade doors? How much space is there to maneuver trucks in and out? Is there any additional yard space for storage or for parking trucks? What's the power of the building? Is it sprinklered? Is it it's their makeup air if it's needed? How much office space is there? Is it in a good area of town? There's more of like just a checklist, and it's a mental checklist that I've developed just for having done this as long as I have now. But anyone that's considering investing in industrial is going to have to go through these same type of exercises. And really the only way to do that is just to look at what all the comparable properties are going for and how they're being marketed. But once I go through that exercise of determining, is there anything that I should be aware of that could be a big problem in leasing this thing down the road when that tenant eventually leaves, then I can start going through the more glamorous element of creating a pro forma and making some assumptions and manipulating numbers here or there so I can meet my targets. But before I even look at what the potential upside is, I want to make sure I'm minimizing or ideally eliminating any downside risk.
Yeah, sure. And then when coming up with the value, see, this would be a lot different than residential. Like residential, you just look at comps. Value is dictated a lot based on the rent also, right?
Absolutely. I'm a big believer that value of commercial or industrial specifically is a function of the rent. It's like a direct function of how much that building can rent for. So when I'm going through that downside risk calculation, I want to make sure that that building is comparable on a direct side-by-side comparison with what other buildings are. No two industrial buildings are going to be unique, but you can get a pretty good, or are going to be the same, but you can get a pretty good idea. If you're looking at a 20,000 square foot a manufacturing building, you'll be able to get some relatively comparable comps on what's of the other 20,000 square foot buildings that either sold in the last year or two, or perhaps are being marketed right now. But you also want to, and from the understanding that it's a function of the rent, you need to figure out what are other buildings leasing for. So if you have a really good understanding of what that building is and what it isn't, you should be able to calculate what a market rate for that is. And maybe you make some adjustments, minor adjustments. So maybe you think the market's $8 a square foot, but your property has more yard. So maybe you add a little bit on there. Maybe the property doesn't have enough power, so maybe you take a little bit off. Just using arbitrary examples there. But you can come up with a pretty good idea of what the rate is. And if you can put a cap on that market rate, it is a very, very basic back of the envelope math, you can come up with a value.
Okay, gotcha. What made you get into this space? This is like a really unique space here.
Purely accidental, actually. When I started in 2005, I thought I'd be commercial real estate. I thought I'd be working with sexy office towers or big shopping malls. Just so happened that the office was heavily focused on industrial. I had very little understanding of what industrial even was. So purely accidental, but I'm very glad that I did, because it's been a huge advantage in my mind working in an area that's been pretty steady for the last 17 years or so. Whereas office, I can't even imagine the pain that I would have had if I would have put all my eggs investing in office right now. And retail also looks a little, I think retail will be flat for a while. So it was purely accidental, but I'm very grateful that I did, because it's been a great 17 years so far.
Yeah, and you're right. Yeah, because office is getting crushed. I heard it's still holding, but yeah, especially with everyone working from home, stuff like that.
I think it's still going to get worse. It's just my guess on it, because a lot of those leases, especially like the larger ones that will really move the needle, like a big company called that was leasing 100,000 square feet in a tower. They weren't on like a year-to-year lease. They probably did a 5 or 10-year lease, maybe even longer when they got in there. So we won't really see the impact of people working from home and companies adjusting how much office they need until those leases start flipping over. I think there's going to be a lot of companies that give back office space. So there's people that seem to be optimistic that the office will recover. I think that there's still pain in the forecast.
Yeah, I agree with you too. Like here in Pittsburgh, we have a lot of the high rises, and some companies just take the whole floor. It's got to be a 6-digit rent per month. And you're right, they might have a 5 or 10 year lease, so they're still going to stick it out. But when that comes up, they may decide, hey, we're going to downsize and do something different.
I think it's inevitable. I don't see anything stopping at this point. We're 2.5 years since the pandemic started, and everything's back to normal in North America right now. Everybody's going to concerts. People are traveling again. People don't feel uncomfortable being around big group settings right now. So there's no reason that office shouldn't have come back now at this point, other than the fact that people don't want to go. And just a little bit of side note on this as well. I don't want to go down the office rabbit hole, but I think that if you're an employee, and let's call this pre-pandemic, your office conditions where you had to travel 30 to 60 minutes to get to the downtown market, then you had to go through a parkade, and then you had to go on an elevator, and then you had to get to your office, and then your office was a cubicle with very little natural light, and you were sitting there all day doing some menial task like data entry or answering the phone. And then the pandemic came, and now you could do all of that from home, and you don't have to do that commute. You don't have to go in parkades and elevators. You don't have to sit in a dimly lit cubicle, and you could stay home. Well, of course people are going to want to do that. Like, it'd be unreasonable that somebody wouldn't do that. So I think the only way that office can get people back is if they just dramatically change the conditions on how somebody experiences that job. Otherwise, why would anyone want to go back to working in a cubicle? To me, it's just inconceivable. But for the people that have a nice office space and there's amenities there, and you get to be around other people, and you can collaborate, and you can bounce ideas off people, and you can just be in front of people, from the standpoint that if you're a company and you had to do a round of layoffs, are you going to lay off somebody that you see all the time and you interact with and you have the odd lunch with and you can see what they're doing? Or are you going to lay off the person that's working from home who you haven't seen in person in a year? I think I know who would get laid off. I don't want to speak for anyone that's in that uncomfortable position, but I think I know who's going to get laid off in that scenario. So there's a trade-off there as well. The employee is saying, I don't want to do that commute. I don't want to sit in a poor working condition. I understand that. But the trade-off is that you're probably not first in line for a promotion. You're probably first in line if a cut in the workforce has to come. So it's a trade-off. Long-winded answer saying office still has some pain in the immediate forecast here.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, I never thought about that either, because you're right. If you got someone's coming into the office all the time, has that face-to-face relationship versus the remote guy, they may get preference.
I can't see how they wouldn't. And I know that even at our office, the people that you see all the time, you just have a deeper relationship with them. You just having that water cooler talk, or just having a coffee or having lunch with them. It's different from the people you don't see all the time. It's just you create different relationships.
Right. Hey, what are some mistakes? Say an investor wants to get involved in industrial, switch over from, let's say, single family or multis, things like that. What are some mistakes you see that they might be able to avoid?
The biggest one is rushing into it. And going back, I hope I was tried anyways to communicate that commercial industrial can be more complex than apartment buildings or single family houses. It can be more complex. So the investors that rush into industrial, those are the ones that I find make mistakes. And it could just be an oversight. It could be not realizing that ceiling heights were important. It could be not looking at the fact that the building will be vacant at some point down the road. I can do a quick story here as well about an investor that I know that bought a property about 15 minutes outside of our major area. So it's still technically part of the CMA, but it wasn't directly in the city. And he bought it with a large construction company that was the tenant. They had 4 years left on the lease. 2 years into the lease, the tenant told the landlord that they were vacating the building. They still continued to pay rent, but they were trying to sublease it at the time. So it went the whole 2 years. They paid their rent all the time. That building's now been vacant for over a year, and he probably would have to take, I'm just guessing, probably 30 to 40% less in rent to lease it right now versus what he was getting from that construction company. And the worst part is that he's getting zero right now, paying all the bills, paying the property taxes, paying the insurance. But the worst part in my mind, well, I mean, that the money's got to suck. So maybe that's probably the worst part. But another bad part is that a term of his insurance is that somebody has to go into the building every 2 days to make sure that there's been no vandalism or no floods or nothing's happened in the building. So for him, it's about a 45-minute drive each way. So he has to do that drive every 2 days, an hour and a half or so, plus the time it takes to walk through the building every 2 days just to satisfy the provision in his insurance. So that there's a scary story of somebody that rushed into investing, made a purchase. Had they gone through that exercise of saying, what is this property worth if it's vacant? They would have realized that construction company was paying a higher than average lease rate. So it can be a scary proposition. So I would say for anyone that wants to consider industrial, just be prepared. It's a process. You don't want to say, I want to invest in industrial and I want to buy a property Q1 of 2023. You're going to say, I might buy a property at some point in 2023, but first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to learn everything I can about industrial real estate as an asset class. So all the limitations that could be there that we talked about, but then I also want to be an expert in my market. So, and then that's why I'm just a big believer in investing in my market, is because I know everything that's happening here. I know the lease rates. I know what properties are selling. I've got a really good finger on that proverbial pulse of the market. But that takes time. It would be unreasonable to expect an investor could, let's say Pittsburgh, you were deciding that Pittsburgh was a good market for you to consider industrial. It'd be unreasonable to say that you can be an expert on everything that's happening in that market within a few months. It's just going to take much longer. You're going to start digesting all the information that's coming up, start looking at all the leases that you can find information on, all the properties that have sold, going through all the quarterly reports that brokerages put out, driving through the market, figuring out where all the different locations are. That is just a process. So I always say to someone that's looking at industrial for the first time, just be prepared to be patient. The last thing you want to do is be that investor that I just described, who's probably going to lose, I don't know, $700,000-800,000 would be my guess on that property and on what that's lost. It's just that you do not want to be that investor. I started as a broker in 2005. It was 9 years before I bought my first industrial property in 2014. So I'm probably on that far end of that spectrum. Probably someone that waited a really long time, but somewhere in between. Like, find a happy medium. You don't want to be the investor that goes to try to buy something day one when you don't know anything about it. Maybe you don't want to wait 9 years, because that's a long time as well. But you want to find somewhere in between.
Yeah, and you're right too, because like say single family, if you buy one, you make a little bit of a mistake, you're still not sitting on a vacant property for a year or two. Versus commercial, you make a mistake, it's a lot harder to rent because there's a lot smaller of a audience.
Absolutely, you're spot on with that. Like, it's even with like a multifamily, it's hard to make a big mistake in multifamily if you're doing your due diligence, getting like an inspection and going through just proper due diligence. It's hard to make a big mistake in that either. But you can make catastrophic mistakes in industrial. There's upside as well. So I like to say that industrial should be a little scary. Like, people should go into it with a healthy amount of fear, because that's what will help you avoid making those mistakes in the first place.
Yeah. And I hear from other guys too, they love industrial and they love the commercial space because the tenants are there for a long time. Excuse me. So unlike residential, you might have high churn. It's like, okay, when you get someone and the property's the right fit for them, they're there a long time for you. So it's a lot less maintenance and turn on that side as well.
Yeah, and even piggybacking on that idea is the fact that you're dealing with less tenants in general. So like one property that I have it's about a 15,000 square foot manufacturing facility, and there's one tenant in there. It's a Fortune 1000 tenant. They're in there for a long term. We bought that for about $3.1 million. Can you imagine what you would need to buy if you were to deploy $3 million worth of cash? I'm guessing you're probably looking at like a 10-15 unit apartment building, or you're looking at 10 houses, maybe less than that. But that all comes with 10 tenants. We have one tenant in there. They're responsible for everything. So we don't get calls that the toilet's plugged. We don't get calls that a light burned out. It's all taken care of by the tenant. And it allows us to scale a portfolio a lot more. And like you said, you've got the comfort of knowing that they're in there for a long time versus, again, having like a 15-unit multifamily building. You're probably turning over a couple tenants every year. Now try to scale that. If you want to get to the level where you're deploying $30-40 million, how many systems do you have to have in place to manage that many tenants and all the turnover that comes with it versus scaling in industrial or commercial? where you have less tenants and they're corporations. I think that's the other key thing to emphasize as well, is that we're leasing to corporations. There's people behind the corporation, obviously, but it's the corporation that's the tenant on there. So you get to see their financial statements, you get to see how much they have in retained earnings, how much their income is, what they have on their balance sheet. You get to do a pretty good deep dive into the health of that corporation, and you're not beholden to any residential landlord tenancy rules. And I know that varies across North America, but you and I both live in areas that have snow in the winter. Can you imagine how difficult it is trying to evict a tenant in December if it's a family that has 3 kids? There's no judge in the world that's going to kick out a family in December when there's snow out there. They're going to give them every allowance they possibly can to come up on their bills. Commercial and industrial, just for the most part, follows contract law. So whatever you have in your lease is going to govern that arrangement. You don't have a judge that's sympathetic to a family that might be evicted in the middle of winter. It's contract law. And a lot of the times those leases are written in favor of the landlord so that they have options and abilities if the tenant defaults on it. So I guess it kind of goes full circle. I say that there's a lot of negative things about considering industrial, at least for first-time investors. But when you consider all the positives on it, that's why I'm such a big fan of it, and why I wouldn't go away from industrial anytime in the near future.
Yeah, dealing with big corporations, do you see them beating you up whenever it comes time for lease renewal? Because I know a lot of them have professional negotiators for that.
They do, and that is a challenge, absolutely. The offset of that, though, is that, and just another quick example, we were just dealing with a tenant that had $2 million that they had invested in their space. So is running a whole bunch of advanced electricity, HVAC systems, they had a whole bunch of makeup air in there. They had invested $2 million into the facility. So when they came to try and push on their renewal period, the landlord felt that they were in a pretty good position of power and said, well, this is our rate. If it doesn't work for you guys, we totally understand. And you could be the best negotiator in the world. If somebody draws a hard line in the sand and calls your bluff, and you realize that you're going to have to leave that $2 million of infrastructure behind and spend that again in the next building, it changes pretty quickly. So that's one reason that I think industrial actually is, I don't want to say bulletproof, because there are still issues, but where it's got more power than other asset classes, that the tenants have to invest a lot in their operations. Not all, of course. There's some that can come in. If it's just a simple warehouse, they might not have a lot of money invested in it. So in that scenario, absolutely, you could have a negotiator that comes in that does try to hammer you on renewal. If you're in a market, and industrial's been very, very good over the last decade, where you're sub 5% vacancy, most landlords are just in a position that they're willing to say, well, if you're not going to be the tenant, then we're just going to wait for the next tenant to come in. And actually, just one more point on that too, because even how most leases are structured, that option to renew, if they have an option to renew, or at least a conversation, starts 6 to 12 months out in advance. So the landlord's going to have a pretty good idea that if that tenant isn't going to renew, or they're trying to play too much hardball, you might have a 6-month runway to find another tenant. And if you're in a really good market with low vacancy, and you feel confident that excuse me, that your building doesn't have any functional obsolescence or doesn't have anything that's a detriment, those landlords are just going to take it back to the market.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you're right. There's a lot of moving parts there. Hey, Jed, we're about out of time. What's the best way people can reach you, and what can you help people out with?
Well, I love talking about industrial real estate, as you could tell. So I've got a YouTube channel where I just try to give as much information as I can. So it's just Chad Griffiths, CRE. If you search industrial real estate on YouTube, you'll find my channel, because I think I've done over 200 videos now. So that's probably the best place, or email or LinkedIn is also great. I'll share those with you if I haven't already.
Okay, great. Yeah, everyone listening, we'll have those in the show notes. And hey, Chad, thanks for coming on. We appreciate you.
Yeah, that was awesome. I can tell that you do love, breathe, and sleep real estate as well. So I really appreciate the awesome conversation there.
You know, man. Hey, thanks for everyone for listening. Get out there, crush it, and close some deals. Hey, we'll see you next time.